Courtney Murdoch from Love Lives On, and today I am speaking with Dr. Bonnie Stewart, a digital and social media expert on how we grieve in the digital age. Welcome, Dr. Stewart, and thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. And Bonnie is fine.
Bonnie is fine. Okay, perfect. Bonnie, on your personal blog, Crib Chronicles, you've written an entire section dedicated to coping with grief and loss after the loss of your child. What motivated you to share your personal experiences online?
It's funny because I often say, I started that blog in actually 10 years ago this month, in April of 2006. And it was a year after my first child, my son Finn, had died as a newborn. And about 2 weeks before my second son, Oscar, my eldest living child, was born. Early. Again, early is my pregnancy motif. But so I was about 7 months pregnant. I had spent the previous 2 months on hospital bed rest in another province because I live in Prince Edward Island, which is a very small place on the east coast of Canada. And if you have any serious pregnancy difficulties prior to 32 weeks of pregnancy, you get sent off island. And so I had been off island for the delivery and for a number of weeks of bed rest before my firstborn's birth. He was born and died in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And I was again in Halifax, Nova Scotia for these 2 months before Oscar was born in a bed in a room identical to the room I'd been in the year before. Had been keeping some friends and family kind of apprised by mass email. And then I hit 32 weeks of pregnancy and I was sent home to Prince Edward Island. And so because in my pregnancy the year before with Finn, I had been airlifted to Halifax at 24 weeks pregnant. I had never really been publicly huge. Really big and walking around. And so I found myself suddenly able to go to the grocery store as a visibly pregnant woman. Whereas in my first pregnancy, by the time that I was sent over at 24 weeks, I was in that indeterminately chubby phase, right? Where no one necessarily was ridiculous enough to go, "Oh, you're pregnant," because I might not have been. And so suddenly I was in that unmistakably, especially after 2 months of bed rest and second pregnancy in a year, I was unmistakably pregnant. But I found myself having these, normal pregnancy experiences, I guess, and the encounters at the grocery store that are perceived as innocuous, where people say, "Is this your first?"
Yes.
And I had no idea how to answer that question because I had realized, relatively quickly after the death of Finn, that dead babies are not something that our culture knows how to talk about. Mm-hmm. And that encountering people who think they're having a random pleasantry moment in their day, with that kind of, the weight of that information wasn't something that they were comfortable with or I was comfortable being in that encounter. Yeah. And yet to say, "Oh yes, this is my first," felt like this terrible betrayal of my child, who I was very much still grieving. My partner and I I'll backtrack just a bit. My partner and I had decided, I guess about 5 months after Finn's death, that I was in my 30s and I realized that the grief experience was going to be a journey and a long road, and that if I waited until I was done, if there was such a thing as done with it or healed before moving on and trying to have another child, that I would spend the whole time half grieving Finn and half grieving or in sort of this paralyzed anxiety about would I ever get to parent a living child. So we just decided for us that the decision would be that we would try again. And it didn't mean that I was all better and, fine and all those things, but just that I wanted to have my sort of space, I guess, in my own self and head for grieving Finn, separate from that fear and grief around would I ever have a baby that I could take home. Yes. And we, of course, got pregnant immediately, which was wonderful and also made for a very terrifying pregnancy that I wasn't fully ready for. And then I ended up back in hospital and there were a lot of complications. And so there I was, suddenly home, suddenly to all external audiences, a normal pregnant woman for the first time. And I realized that I didn't know how to navigate that double identity because I was very much still thinking of and in the process of grieving Finn, and at the same time was genuinely, truly excited and hopeful about the second baby. And I didn't have a space in my physical life outside of with, my partner and a couple of very close friends, family members, to articulate that at all. And so my partner worked online a lot at that time. I didn't so much, but he said, why don't you start a blog? I'll buy a domain. What do you want to call it? And we'll set it up. And I kind of went, well, okay, because I had been sending these, email updates kind of to friends and family. And I tried to keep them fairly light because I didn't want to overload people's inbox. I was wary of taking up space, I guess, with my grief. But I felt like maybe in a blog, I could make room for the double voices inside myself, the hopeful parent to be, and the grieving parent. And so for me, it was always kind of an identity blog more than a grief blog. Very much about sort of the two worlds that I was standing in. And I later, because I wrote that blog for 6 years, I stopped in 2012. I started it in April of 2006. I wrote it until June of 2012. And at that point, I really felt that both my living children's early childhoods were coming to an end. I was starting to grapple with the idea of telling, stories that weren't necessarily mine to tell. But I was also coming to a point where I was through with that place and that identity of actively grieving Finn, and had come to a place of healing that I wanted to kind of celebrate by closing that voice. But for those 6 years, it was me trying to put my actual lived self in all its complexity into voice. And the blog gave me kind of a private-ish space where I can invite people once and just say, hey, I'm writing this, and then just leave it be. I didn't read blogs at the time. I didn't read mommy blogs. I didn't read grief blogs. I didn't know they existed. Mm-hmm. After I started writing, the couple of people that I knew in my circle who commented often turned me on to other blogs. I found out that there was this massive, massive network of people out there who were connecting and commenting on all forms of, parenthood, identity, grief, all of those many places. I suddenly found people to talk to online about things that I really had no one to talk to about in my own life, because I was the first person that I ever knew to lose a child, certainly outside of miscarriage, but to lose a living child. And that had not been a trajectory in life that I had really even understood was something that, happened on a regular basis. And so it was very normalizing and helpful for me to find these other voices in this community.
Yeah, because like you said, it's not something that's really, for whatever reason, openly talked about. So just creating that conversation, that community, is hugely important.
It was. And, I think generally I think grief is part of the human experience that we don't culturally make much room for at this juncture. And so online offers sort of rooms in the cultural experience that can be more difficult to navigate face-to-face.
Mm-hmm. And are there any therapeutic benefits for expressing grief through online and social media channels? And is it a practice that you would recommend for someone struggling with grief, given your experiences?
For me, it was incredibly positive and therapeutic and helpful. Now, I wouldn't recommend it for everybody. I am someone who journaled my entire life. I loved to write. I had a fairly strong internal sense of voice, even when I began writing. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that was a pleasure and therapeutic. And I had an established process within my identity where I was kind of accustomed to writing my way through stuff, just not necessarily publicly. Some people hate to write. And so it might not be the method for them. Some people might. I'm not as aware of a lot of sort of grief-based vlogs and that type of thing because there are different tones that govern kind of what gets picked up on YouTube and that sort of thing. But they may exist, and there may be. I know that Instagram is a place where there are grief communities and people share simply pictures. So there are multiple ways of communicating online. Mine was particularly writing, partly because it was 2006 and writing was still quite dominant. I also was blogging. Really, this was just before social media hit. So it was the year that Facebook and Twitter just started making it into the mainstream. I didn't use Facebook or Twitter at the time I began blogging. And by the time that I did adopt both of those in 2007, I already had this, surprising to me, large participatory network of people who commented on each other's blogs. Yeah. And so it helped me really enter into those social media or network spaces because I already had this pre-existing network established around the blog. But it also, blogging is much more long form than, and tends to have or can be, personal blogging can be more confessional and a little bit less all publics than something like Facebook is. So I love social media. I study social media and I research it. Yes. But my research actually doesn't focus on grief or identity as much as it does sort of scholarship. Yeah. And every platform on social media is a different social space. And there can be ways to build audiences and bring audiences to very personal narratives in different ways. But on Facebook, particularly, what you've got is often collapsed audiences. And so I eventually did start sharing my blog posts on Facebook, but it took me a couple of years to develop a comfort because I knew that then I was communicating to people I hadn't seen since high school. Yeah. That I had a child that had died. And I wasn't, as I sometimes run into those people in, the grocery store, because I live in the town that I grew up in. I left for many years and then I moved back, right, the same year that Finn was born. And not everybody necessarily was aware of that aspect about me, so I was collapsing audiences there and had to sort of slowly get my feet wet in terms of wearing that identity publicly. At the same time, I think it was helpful for me also there were also people that I encountered who knew, because people always know when terrible things happen in people's lives, right? And when they are unexpected things, because we live in a culture that doesn't navigate grief with great comfort. Yeah. And I often don't know what to say to people. Yeah. So I was afraid, and I think to some extent did become, after Finn's death, that lady whose baby died. And the blog and sharing the blog on Facebook in that public way became a sort of introductory space where people I hadn't seen in years, when I did run into them in the grocery store, could say, I saw your blog post. That was really moving. I'm really sorry. You write beautifully, whatever. But it allowed a way into the conversation where otherwise, I think previous to that, I'd probably run into some who were standing there going, gosh, I really like crackers too, kind of going, is she okay? Should I mention this? I don't know if I should mention this. Yeah. It gave people permission to mention it. It meant that I was essentially inviting people into acknowledgement. Yes. And that was helpful as well. Yeah. So for me, yes, it was actually therapeutic. The writing process itself also just allowed me space to think out loud, space to think with others, and gave me a record that I now have of what it was like to be me then, because I found that grief was very much a strange route, like visiting another country, that once you are not there anymore, you can remember being there, but you can't necessarily remember how it smelled and how it felt, and what the heat was like on your face, kind of thing, when you go to a hot climate when you're from here. But when I go back and read blog entries from there, there's a rawness and a gutted that I'm very grateful not to live in anymore. Yes. But I'm also grateful to have that record. Yeah. Of that process, of that piece of I guess parenting, a child who was not here, through to the point where I was able to let go.
Well, that leads nicely into my next question, which is many people who have lost a loved one, especially a child, often express a fear that their loved one will be forgotten.
Yeah.
And do you think that social media has helped people in a way with this because it provides a lasting digital legacy in a way for your loved one?
I think it certainly can. I mean, I had a very positive experience with that because in writing sometimes about Finn, and a lot of my blog actually wasn't necessarily focused on Finn himself, but a lot of it was focused on my living children, on the identity experiences that I was going through, part of which included Finn's presence and absence in my life. But it made for a place where I could use his name. Yeah. And it made for a place where other people who weren't necessarily around me in my community could use his name as well. Yeah. And when I came to the point where I closed the blog, I guess it was 7 years after his birth. It would have been the anniversary of his 7th birthday. And I had written a Facebook post that day because at that point I had been writing long enough that I did actually just post it as a Facebook post and then wrote the blog post the next day. But where I just acknowledged that these were the busy things running around with little kids that I was doing that day, and then I raced in the midst of the chaos of having little folks and noted that it was exactly the time of day at which he'd been born. And just kind of had a moment of acknowledging that and just kind of remembering, and shared that on Facebook and got a great deal of just sort of the ambient likes of like, I hear you. Yeah. I see him. I remember with you. That meant a great deal. And that ended up, the blog post that I wrote about that, processing that, ended up being one of the last posts that I wrote because I realized then that I didn't need to do that anymore, that was the last time at which I needed that, but it had meant a huge amount to me because I understood that in this wide community, his name meant something to people. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, that's really all that you can ask and do, right? And so it felt like I had, I had done that job. Yeah. And it, yeah, I had created that small legacy. And that meant more than I would ever have expected, but it did mean a lot.
And do you think that social media has impacted the way that we as a society support people who are coping and struggling with grief?
I think it can. I think sometimes, certainly, it gives us the opportunity to be present with people when we are not physically present. I think that honoring lives and respecting people's absence in other people's lives is a huge part of building healthy communities. And there's a reason why every culture has their own, funeral traditions and loss traditions. And as we become a globalized society where most of us live far from family and far from people we grew up with, there are a lot fewer and fewer ways in which we are able to do that face to face. And so, even though I live in the town that I grew up in, I still don't always see when, for instance, I'm reaching the age where sometimes peers that I grew up with are dying, and certainly their parents are dying, and I don't always know. Mm-hmm. Facebook is actually often the means by which I find out, because I don't really read the newspaper, and I don't really read the obituaries. And so Facebook allows me to know. Sometimes I actually go to the funeral home because I'm still here present and I'm able to participate in that ritual if it's happening. But often, if I didn't actually know the parent, but I simply grew up with the grown adult child, I'm still able to say, hey, I'm really sorry. If I have a memory of that parent from our shared childhood, I will share it. It allows a relatively ambient opportunity to express care. Right. And I know, I know some people have said, it takes the human connection
exactly
out of the experience. I would argue, and this comes really from my other research, that people who say that truly don't understand or want to understand the online as a connected space. And there are narratives that circulate in our society. Screens are making us more absent. Most of the time, unless we're actually playing video games on screens, we are communicating with people. They may be of more interest to us than the people in front of us at that time, but that's an etiquette issue, not a lack of connection issue. And so as a teacher, right, I teach people to teach online. I teach online. Mm-hmm. I consider screens in my classroom a real challenge to me, not for me, but to me, to engage people, right? Engage people, sometimes using the digital, sometimes in very face-to-face, critical ways. But these are simply tools that expand our capacity to connect with people if we use them that way. So I don't think that online and offline grieving are competing with each other. I think a person can grieve in both and somewhat differently. For me, actually, the online opened up spaces that simply do not exist face-to-face, because I knew almost immediately when my son died that, and I realized in many early encounters shortly after, that people do not know what to say. People are uncomfortable. That discomfort gets unloaded onto the grieving person. It takes pretty big shoulders to even engage in those kinds of conversations. If you are really in an absolutely abject space and you sit down on a park bench next to someone and you say, "My baby died," they just kind of look at you, because that's not speakable in public. It is simply not something that we do. Online gives people a space to say that. Some people don't want to read it on Facebook. I would argue that is their problem, not the problem of the person grieving. And because platforms on social media, again, there are many, many different options around audience and public and private. You could have a blog but never share it on Facebook, so that your Aunt Norma or those people you went to high school with don't necessarily have to encounter it, not to protect them, but to protect you from their discomfort if you don't wish to. But certainly, I think the capacity to find other people who are grieving, especially for folks who live in, small, under-resourced kind of places where there may not be support groups, there may not be people your age who have any sense of the experience that you're going through. And even if there are, you may find that expressing yourself or communicating with others who express themselves better in writing than in person is just more comfortable for you. So it gives people more options to grieve. It doesn't necessarily have to replace the act of, being face-to-face with someone. But grief is a long process. And we tend not to be very good at supporting people through the truly long arc of it. And that's something that I think online does far better than face-to-face, if you take the time to, connect and build and seek out the community that you need of people who may be going through similar things, if that's of value to you, because your face-to-face peer group probably can only sustain that for so long.
Really well said. What do you think that the future has in store for grieving online or through social media?
It's interesting. I don't know. My future fortune teller. I like to joke. My Twitter bio, very tongue-in-cheek, says that I'm a social media fortune teller. But really,
putting it to the test now.
Yeah, I'm joking. Yeah. I don't think it's going to go away. I do think that grief is very much part of the human experience that we are still finding spaces and places to work through. I have a couple of. I think my concern about social media generally is that the connected participatory spaces on all fronts of human identity and life are to some extent often being co-opted by monetizing opportunities. And so there will probably be increasing search engine optimization types of operations at work, where if a person were to search for a community of fellow grievers, one might find things being sold to one rather than actually that community. And so we all need sort of higher levels of digital literacies probably to find people in the same boat than we might have, or resources to support our friends through experiences than we might have a few years ago. But at the same time, I also think that the other piece that we need to sort of figure out how to work with is legacy pieces. And so this would be less related to my own experience because my son died at a day old and, did not have the opportunity to develop his own Facebook account. But a couple of years ago, one of the women that I met when I was first blogging, she was a woman who had 2 preschoolers at the time, and we were simply engaging as sort of fellow writers. She was a scientist. She wrote really interesting stuff about her kids. She was one of the first people to ever comment on my blog. The summer after, I guess I first really got engaged in that, probably the summer of 2007, she found out that she had a very aggressive form of breast cancer. And she went through treatment, she went through chemo, all those pieces. I got to meet her about 4 years later in the spring of 2011, and she died in the winter of 2012. She was a huge part of this early mommy blogging experience for me, but also community, as she spoke at early Blog Her conferences across the US, etc. Her name was Susan, and she went by Why Mommy on Twitter because her son was a curious little guy, and she was a scientist, and she was so excited to answer all those Why Mommy questions. And of course, she didn't really get to be around to answer all those Why Mommy questions. And so she left this huge legacy and body of work online of narrating her experiences both as a mother and also as a person who was grappling with dying. And she also left this massive network of peers and colleagues and people like myself who loved her and knew her well. And it was interesting and strange, in the days after she died, in the years after she died, where occasionally, because of the weird ways that algorithms work online, she would pop up as having liked a product on Facebook, or because some of those algorithms are not necessarily telling you all things. Or she would pop up as on Twitter when somebody was remembering her, or her best friend, her lifelong best friend, who is part of that network as well, posted about her just the other day because it was her birthday. And so she kind of continues to have this half-life. Her social media identities and occasionally her blog posts. And there is that moment of joy and sorrow when I encounter her face and her name, and yet the great privilege of maybe getting to see her face again, or encounter her words again, or have her just intersect with my day again. And I think we are all beginning to see these and have to navigate these kind of experiences as loved ones die and their Facebook accounts live on. Do we close them? How do we deal with these things? And so these questions of how we grieve online, how we manage legacy accounts, what the etiquette is around, continuing to express grief. Are there windows after which one doesn't say anything on Facebook? My son, my firstborn's 11th birthday will be at the end of this month. I don't know if I will mention it on Facebook. I can't remember if I did last year. Part of me still feels that it is a negation of him not to, and part of me feels like perhaps it is time not to. And some of those are internal questions, and a lot of those are really questions about the culture and audience that we live in. And so we don't have answers yet, and I think we are making them as we go. And I think that it can be really healthy to, talk about these things and sort of ask these questions together and support each other through this very important part of living and healing and continuing to live after others are gone.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. This has been just an amazing experience for me and for our viewers as well, for sure.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's
It's a
my
pleasure
pleasure.
to talk to you.
This is Courtney from Love Lives On. Thank you for watching. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our YouTube channel for more ways that we can celebrate our loved ones' lives now and forever.